Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. It's been a pleasure knowing you all these years, Heystek. We've known each other almost 4 years. You were on the show in the very beginning, and I'm glad you came back so many times. We've had probably 5 or 6 discussions.
Hey, Robbie. Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure being on your show. And yes, I can't believe it has been 4 years already.
Now, from our first discussion, I always brought up the topic of aliens. And then it seems like through the times, your opinion has probably changed. Your perspective of things has probably changed. Mine has changed back and forth between what is it? What is this? I'm curious, before we dive into this whole entire subject, anything new happening in your realm or your side of the world?
So anything new, my side of the world and realm. So one thing I've noticed is a lot more conspiracy theories popping up about extraterrestrial life. And what's also happened in between is the new Mars rover that's sending back some great images. There was NASA's DART mission that's still happening, that's going to deflect an asteroid. So in the space world, there's some awesome stuff going on.
When you said conspiracies about extraterrestrial life, can I just ask what are some of these conspiracies? And first of all, do you think it like aliens? Do you think that obviously there's probably life out there somewhere in the universe, but you're not of the belief maybe that they've touched down here?
Not yet. So my opinion is yes, it doesn't make sense that we are the only intelligent species in the universe. But I don't think they have touched down on Earth yet. So if that would happen, I think there would be a lot more media frenzy and crazy about it. And we live now in an age where everybody has a cell phone with a camera. They can actually take decent pictures and videos that can confirm it.
Well, what do you think about the government talking about it?
That is interesting. So for that, I don't know what is real and what is not, but it is interesting to monitor and just hear other people's opinions, hear what's the government's opinion about it, and see what's other researchers' opinions about it.
Well, what do you think is more plausible, that it's like a weather phenomena, or do you think it is something? I mean, you have to think about all the occurrences that have been happening with aliens or people, the government talking about all these incidences where their UAV or something has gone down. And there's a certain case like the US Nimitz, for instance, seeing these, this thing that moves like something that a human made machine could not do. A person couldn't survive this craft taking off at such speeds and doing such turns. It would literally squish a person that would be inside of it. So they chalk it up to an occurrence they can't explain and what they call this UAP phenomena, which I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater with it. Like I do like the topic of it. I think there could be a possibility, but I'm more in belief that it's like government tech. I'm more in belief that it's some type of weather phenomena, because I mean, we're still learning things about what we're doing to our atmosphere, just with either pollution or whatever you want to say. Where I go, I mean, to think that that doesn't have a buildup effect, that maybe we're now seeing the kind of, like a mirage. That's something that comes from extreme heat. Your brain's under pressure, it starts to see things. I go, that's probably what a lot of this stuff could be chalked up to. But when it comes on to cameras and it comes on to like jamming signals or targeting devices in our military, I start going, I don't know what that could be unless our equipment has never came across this type of anomaly before.
That is very true. But I also believe it could be military vehicles being tested. So if you think back at the Cold War, the first sighting that people thought was a UFO is actually the U-2 spy plane, because they weren't a plane able to fly that high until it actually came out, well, it is the U-2 spy plane. And after that, it was the SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest plane ever built. And then after that, people said they saw a weird diamond-shaped aerial vehicle. That must be an UFO. Then it came out, well, it was actually a B-2 stealth bomber. So yes, there could be new weapons and vehicles being developed. We have no idea what it is because it's still top secret, but those kinds of vehicles still needs to be tested.
Well, I mean, you work at the observatory, and I mean, have you noticed anything, or have you maybe had to conduct a different type of curriculum since our first chat? I mean, our first chat, we talked about like we did send a signal at one point up into space to see if they contact alien life. It was a long time ago, but now they're talking about doing it again. And I just start wondering if this is like a conspiracy theory, or if this is stuff that maybe we probably shouldn't be going in this direction. I start to question, is academics or other people at these institutions, these observatories, or these places of science that are looking up at the stars, are they starting to get new kind of implementations of their daily policies only on the concept of alien life, or this idea that now it's being talked about more?
So the other thing that's came across the last year, and the different governments all around the world are paying attention to it, are now actually appointing or creating a position called a planetary protection officer. So I know the US already has one, other countries as well. And the idea for this person is, say, for example, you get microbes from space to bring it back to Earth, what safety protocols are in place. And the same counts for, say, for example, you encounter another life form. So what protocols is there to bring it back to Earth? So do we need to quarantine it? Do we need to place it in a lab? Or what safeties are in place? And that is actually something being investigated. And another branch of science that's popped up the last 2 years is astrobiology, to look at what is the biology in space. How does space influence not only the human body, but different microbes, plant life, animal life, and how life as we know it might differ in space.
I actually had a planetary defense officer on the show before. It's a job you definitely want to put on your resume. But what's really interesting is if we talk about astrobiology, why do you think that there's such this new kind of creation of trying to study life outside the galaxy? Do you think it's to understand it more in the concept of we might not be the only ones out there? Or my belief is it's the way to be able to predict dangers when we are exploring, because I'm seeing a giant push more towards this space civilization, space colonization, as much as me and you talked about before about the weaponization of space, which kind of makes it really, really difficult. When I had a space lawyer on here, I think his name's Franz von der Dunk, he explained that there's a lot of laws and policies set in place, much like there's laws and policies set on Earth, but there is some uncharted territory if you get into the concept of asteroid mining or colonization on a planet. Who deems fit to own that planet or own that specific space? Now, in recent times, we have started mining or doing some type of mining on the moon. We have done some concepts of China, I think is one right now that's pulling out a lot of materials out of there. And we're having a bit of a conflict because it seems like, hey, you can't just take that yet. We have to look at it and validate it and, do whatever you have to in the giant accords or treaties between nations. But it just leads to this concept of like, I think with astrobiology or any type of space endeavors that we're going in now, it's more of the direction of colonizing on another planet to be the first one there. But how do we set up a sustainable system to be able to do so? Because we're not even close to civilization two or classification two. We're not close to what I would say deemed worthy enough to really be able to have I guess, the utilities to be able to colonize on another planet.
That is just, I think in that context, I think it will probably be the same process as the research facility in Antarctica, for example. There's a research facility and it is manned by a volunteers from different countries. So they usually volunteer for a year long. So then they get together. So usually they come together here in South Africa. And then from there, they get on a boat that takes them down to Antarctica. They spend a year there. And then the boat, after a year, the boat picks them up again. And they come back to South Africa and then from there on to their home countries. And I think that's going to be the same principle in space. You're going to have a lot of people that's going to work together. So firstly, it's going to be most likely a scientific endeavor. But from there on, industry is going in and you can start monetizing it. So what's the next logical step is probably going to be tourism. so space tourism or exploration tourism. And then from there, when you refine the technology, it's probably going to be mining or something in that sense to make more money of it.
Well, which do you think is the biggest motivator for the direction we'll be heading in? Do you think it is a way of making money, the tourism angle, which I do agree with, but do you think it's also like the climate change, that topic that always trends back and forth and people's kind of really pressure to find an answer? I feel like that pushes more towards the idea of asteroid mining or being able to try and find resources on a exoplanet or another planet, because I look at all these factors that play into society, because I don't think it's just academia that plays in on society. I think it's society that plays in academia. The way that academia functions and the way that academia flows in the directions that it's going in, I think that's a giant factor of society. What are people really interested in? What are people against? There's these topics that you'll get more funding and you'll get more ideas headed towards that direction and more people researching into it because it influences so much.
And that is very true. So the one influences the other, but a great example we can see where things are strange a bit is the war in the Ukraine, where Russia has shut down the different ISPs going into the Ukraine. So essentially, they have now internet and all communication is blocked and jammed. So Elon Musk and SpaceX provided Starlink internet service. So he sent Starlink antennas, you have your Starlink satellites, and they have communication again. That is one instance where a private organization or a company can make a difference in the world. And then from there on, it depends. One influences academia, academia influences industry, but both usually work together. And one thing that's also been popping up recently is the different mining companies. So Anglo American, De Beers, and all the other big mining companies has set up think tanks to investigate asteroid mining to see what's the plausibility of it and how to achieve it.
I mean, is it a plausible subject to even talk about that? Like, do we have the technology to be able to mine resources off of an asteroid?
So new technology still needs to be developed for it. So one thing is we can get there, but how do you bring the material you mine back? So the idea for that is to have a intermediate point. So the one thing is, for example, you have a base on the moon or another space station for refueling, because if you want to travel somewhere in space, most of your fuel and power is used to leave Earth's gravitational pull, so to get to escape velocity. So the idea is you get into a smaller rocket or space vehicle just to leave Earth's gravity. You go to the space station, you go to the moon, and there on you can go into a bigger vehicle that uses much less energy to travel somewhere in the solar system. And then from there on, say, for example, asteroid mining, you'll probably need to set up some sort of a base on the asteroid or research facility in an asteroid or a space station nearby that you can mine your material, take it back to that central point, and from there on move it back and forward between Earth and that point.
That seems like, see, that just seems like such a long goal in my aspect of things when I look at planetary defense as being a priority in my mind, just because I know the dangers of how many comets and asteroids that just miss Earth. I think the aspect of trying to be able to mine one of these, I think that's a good direction to get resources. But I also, when we go back to society influencing the way that academia or the way that research gets funded or the way the direction we head with research, I think a lot of more people should be aware of the concept of how many dangers actually could impact this earth and completely, level a lot of areas. And as much as the idea of like colonizing on another planet is nice, I think we're also headed in a direction with that same objective, which is studying more about exoplanets, and trying to find one where we can have this Goldilocks scenario of being able to actually colonize on a planet that has similar conditions to Earth. Maybe not the exact same, but doesn't that lead into the concept of terraforming? Now we know we can terraform Earth, we can change the landscape around us. People do it on a daily basis. But imagine being able to do that with an aspect of being able to, with the same technology of mining an asteroid, but being able to direct a asteroid away from Earth to impact a certain planet and cause some type of impact that could actually change the conditions of that planet. The reason why it sounds like this is a crazy scenario is because I've talked to a lot of people who study computer science, and they're looking at how to study the origin of the Big Bang theory, or the Big Bang, not the TV show, the actual Big Bang, and how it came to be. And it's by putting all these random simulations or possible outcomes into a scenario and having the thing generate and generate until they can get them 100% exact lookalike and see if it's replicable. So I start going, if we're just inserting data, how many times can we do that when we study exoplanets? We know impacts from giant asteroids in space can literally change the shape of a planet, can change the shape and direction, the conditions, whatever you want to say, environmental, can make a whole place ice. It can make a whole place super, super hot and all boil to char. To think that we couldn't do that with an aspect of being able to see a planet that has similar conditions, but there might be some type of way to be able to, I don't know, hit it with something in a certain direction and have it completely be livable to the point where we wouldn't need helmets?
Yes, that is actually a very interesting point and an interesting conversation. So yes, those are possible ways to, for example, like I said, terraform a planet. So yes, that is being investigated. So there are research being done about it. There are a lot of simulations being done on it as well. So in my field, we use almost exact same thing. So we use these simulations to see how the Earth formed, how the moon formed. And that is one of the theories of how we have a moon. It's had a big impact about 4.5 billion years ago, hit Earth. And what was left was the Earth, and whatever has broken off was now the moon. And through that, Earth is in a unique position to have life. So that's the idea that we have with the rest of the universe. How can we do terraforming on different planets? Do we set up machines to do terraforming? Can we actually try and move the orbit of something to do terraforming? And this comes down to, I don't know if you watched the sci-fi series The Expanse.
I haven't seen that.
Very good sci-fi series. So that is a topic they discuss in The Expanse well. So in the show The Expanse, Mars has been colonized, but Mars has broken away and formed their own independence and own republic. So Earth and Mars is in a war with one another. And then there's the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, full of minerals and resources. And both Mars and Earth are fighting to who controls the asteroid belt to have the mining rights to the asteroid belt. So that is also an interesting topic. And it also brings us to the topic as well. If we start colonizing different worlds, who controls that world? If we start, for example, we have a colony on Mars and Mars is self-sufficient, or we can travel to Mars and travel from Mars and back, why doesn't stop Mars or Earth to start a war on one another? So there's actually quite an interesting topic on it. So what will it be called? So for example, if Elon Musk reaches Mars, we actually plant a SpaceX flag on the Martian surface? Will he plant a United States flag on the Martian surface? Or will there be a new flag or organization be created, for example, the United Earth flag or something like that?
Well, it's the space treaty of like 1967 or 1972 that was created, that has all these rules established that kind of covers a lot of this broadband, like no space warfare, all these types of things. But there's not a claim on resources. There's not a claim on all these other things that we think of now, because I think everyone got a little bit more greedy. Which even us talking about what we're talking about, like the idea of asteroid mining and all this, the reason why I went this direction in the conversation with this is because when you're mentioning being able to modify aircrafts or being able to modify space vehicles to be able to travel distances, to be able to find resources, I go, that's how it starts. But what always happens is we find a way to make it come to us, make it to the point where we don't have to go very far and we don't have to expend the resources. Right now, we're trying to do missions to Mars, but there's a Mars society out there that's trying to find a way to make it habitable so you can live on there. And these are all different plausible conclusions of building a dome, where I just go, we need psych evaluations on everybody, because there are some people that I would never trust being in a dome with another person. which these are all things that we think of usually down the road, which is just interesting because I think with the topic of mental health being a trending thing, with all these things like that are happening in society, climate change and all this, these topics influence decisions that you wouldn't even think because it would be on a whole different planet, maybe even a whole different solar system. And I think our biggest worry should really be on an aspect of planetary defense. But I also like the possibility of being able to colonize on another planet. But how do you do that sustainably without having that disconnect that happens when you're literally worlds apart?
That's interesting. So, in the Hawaiian Islands, there's actually a research facility that studies what is the psychological effect of people living in close quarters together. And also, for example, if there's a colony on Mars and you live in the domes, what influence would it have? So, on the Hawaiian Islands, I think the Mauna Kea mountain range, they have set up these biodomes. So the people there actually needs to train. So if they want to go outside a building and put on a spacesuit, walk around, then go back, and they actually do psychological tests for the candidates beforehand to see what will be, and they will live there for 6 months to a year. And one thing that I realized is some of these people, I would say there's some friction and they start fighting again with one another. So then they have to diffuse it. But one thing they realized is they've set up a mission control as well that's supposed to be Earth, is that a candidate fights more with mission control than anyone else. So to solve that problem, every couple of weeks they swap out mission control and give mission control a new crew. So it's a new face and you can't be mad at a new face. But that is something going on. And speaking about planetary defense, one of my colleagues went to a conference recently where they talked about, or the aim of the conference was, how do we protect Earth from asteroids, but also how do you protect Earth from space junk? So, for example, satellites. So, satellites being deorbited, what happens if a satellite bumps into another satellite? So usually these satellites, it's law. So if a satellite is at the end of its life, you either need to push it into deep space or you need to deorbit it and it burns out in Earth's atmosphere. But it could be a catastrophic event. For example, a satellite hits another satellite or someone shoots a satellite. So how do you defend yourself from that pieces falling back to Earth or even an asteroid? So one of the ideas is that you have a giant laser. We already have these lasers and you just shoot it at those satellites or the asteroids. The same example how a solar sailor works, where the sunlight pushes your sail and your space vehicle through space. Now you're doing it with a laser and you just nudge that piece of junk or that asteroid a little bit with the laser to change its orbit and it misses Earth.
Now, is it possible to modify the James Webb telescope that's up in outer space that we got up there to be able to do stuff of this sort?
Not modify the James Webb telescope itself, but yes, we can put giant lasers in space. So here where I am at the observatory, we have three giant lasers. So you know a normal red laser pointer that you use to shine against a board or doing
Yeah.
presentations? That's in a range of usually 3 to 6 milliwatts of power. So the lasers we have at the observatory are 1.3 gigawatt pulsed lasers. So very, very powerful lasers. We use it for range finding. But if you use a couple of those lasers, in theory, you should be able to deflect a few pieces of space junk.
Yeah, but what's the theory of some crazy person hijacking that satellite and turning it on, planet Earth?
Yes, so luckily we don't have lasers in orbit yet. But yes, I think there's a law saying no weapons are allowed in space. But yes, that is something that can happen. What's the movie that happened in Geostorm with Gerard Butler?
Mm. Well, there's ideas that were talked about climate change, about being able to fix it by being able to dim parts of the sun. Not Bill Gates' idea of dimming the what is it? Shooting a missile at the atmosphere or something like that, or the ozone layer to be able to dissipate particles that dim the sun. But this idea was being able to find a way to be able to create some type of not really a shield or be able to block some of the radiation that eventually hits Earth to maybe help over time cool it by like 3 or 4 degrees, which I mean is an interesting concept, but I also think that's half-assed concept. Like it's pressured by society because of the aspect of how many people want and are having like this unrealistic expectation of like the earth is going to die tomorrow. And it's like, hang on, it's not like that. If you're going to talk about climate change, it needs to be like orthodontia, slow fixes over time, not just pulling teeth out. It doesn't work like that. But I get it. People want to act fast and act now. And that's where I always bring up ethical concerns about anything, is because when you're really quick to jump the gun on something that's right in your vision of things, you always misstep like maybe a safety concern, maybe something that you would be aware of once you came in contact with that problem rather than being 10 steps ahead of it. And I think with space travel, it's the same thing, which I ask you, what do you think's more plausible? Do you think we're heading in the direction, like if you could pick out of all the things we listed off, all the things we talk about, space colonization, space mining, all these, which is the first one we're going to achieve first?
First one going to achieve is space travel again, and in space colonization. So right now, I know everybody is aiming for Mars, but before Mars, people are aiming for the moon again, to put boots on the moon again, for another person on the moon, and then set up a research center or colony on the moon. And then from there on, it will be easier to go to different planets. So, for example, Mars or other places in the solar system. But yes, that is something that's going to happen first. And that's something that's probably going to happen within our lifetime.
What about the idea of going to, what is it, Venus? I heard Bill Nelson, the NASA director, hop up on television in front of everybody and say that like below the surface of Venus's atmosphere, there's actually like a habitable scenario. So you can either build a cloud city or you can build something. And I might just be like going into the conspiracy side a little bit because I don't think our technology is really there to even be hypothetically speaking about these types of things. But it's just interesting to see the amount of input that gets put into the general public, where I always go, it's got to be a push for funding. And I mean, out of all time throughout history, throughout the years we've known each other to where we're at now, there's probably more than ever a closer eye on what the astronomers are doing compared to all throughout history. I mean, people look to the stars as guidance, but now people are really looking at you guys of like, what is out there? How do we know? And how do we keep ourselves safe? The whole idea of discovery, in my opinion, has kind of been placed on the back burner. Right now, it's more about protecting yourself in some aspects, which I think is important, but it's also about escaping, like getting off of this planet. And I'm like, guys, I'm like, we're heading into space with the really wrong intentions in some aspects.
Very true. And this, what pops into mind now is the movie Don't Look Up from
Yeah.
Leonardo DiCaprio. And that's literally what we deal with every day. On one side, you have people that is, I want to say, literate enough to understand what's going on. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have people that's completely ignorant to what's happening out and what research is about. So yes, it's important to protect Earth. But on the other side is we as humans are a curious species. We want to know how stuff works. We want to find out how things operate. What's the deeper meaning behind stuff? And that is why there will be a exploration part towards it. So what I usually think about is my ideal utopian future would be something like the Star Trek universe, where everybody works together for a common goal, but it will still be a long way for us to achieve a civilization like that and the thinking of that.
Well, we would need some type of intervention from something, which I bring up two possible scenarios. One, how much did the alien topic trending again, or just like the government documents that came out saying that they were talking about it for a long time? How much did that help or did it hurt your field? And also, when it comes to the realm of AI, is that seen as like a beneficial thing on so many things it can do, or do you think it's seen as like an encroachment a little bit on some of the aspects of maybe colonization being inhabited, from what I've heard by Avi Loeb, of these artificial children that we create, these robots being sent to, like, it's interesting to have the Mars rover go to Mars. That's cool. That's really interesting. I was happy about that. But also, do you want every single space voyage to now be encountered with, we don't really need to send a person because a person's expendable. We can just, are not expendable. We can just send a robot that we can make a billion of them and keep sending them out. I mean, eventually we're going to get to the point where we have these space shuttles that have little tiny swarm drones that'll just be able to fly off onto a planet, survey, and be able to detect any type of precious minerals and see if that planet's inhabitable, or not inhabitable, but beneficial in going and excavating there. Like, you're now just tossed out the whole idea of going and exploring to only if it fits or benefits us. And I go, well, the whole point of exploring, you take a crappy car road trip or something like that. You don't know if you're going to get a flat tire, but you have a goal in mind, and that's where you're headed towards. And that should be the same mindset we walk in when we go into the idea of space discovery.
So yes, so with all things of aliens popping up and people talking about it, yes, it has influenced the astronomy community. So the last 3 years, I've been teaching introductory course to astronomy at one of the South African universities. And since I've started teaching the course, each year there are more and more students taking the course. So yes, there are a lot of more interest in astronomy now. And speaking about artificial intelligence, so I'm pro artificial intelligence. I can see the good in it because right now in the astronomy community, yes, you use computer power, you use artificial intelligence. For example, if you have for example, one of the newer telescopes in South Africa is the Meerkat telescope that will become the square kilometer array. So its competition or something more or less the same in the US is the VLA telescope, the very large array. And they right now developing the next generation VLA telescope. But with that, you have loads and loads and loads of data coming through. And with that the data is too much for one single person to go through. So now we need some sort of computer program or artificial intelligence that goes through the data. And when it discovers or sees an interesting feature, it flags it. And then a scientist can literally take that piece of data that's flagged and then look at it and see what's going on. Otherwise, the data is just too much to go through by hand if people do it.
I think there's incredible upsides to AI being able to, fix an area where maybe mankind hasn't really thought of yet. Like, if be able to detect a problem, I mean, you're looking at a bunch of numbers. If it can pick out that one number, that's the issue. A person can overlook that. But I also think that the one ethical concern I think of is the aspect of, now we're going to be much faster paced and rushed, because we start thinking about other countries having the same type of AI technology, maybe even better. And once people start going at this accelerated speed, which is going from like 50 to 100 miles an hour, you're going to have people trying to take a bunch of missions or being able to make a bunch of resource spending and all these things to be able to make sure that they stay in number one, where it brings back to the topic of space colonization or just leaving this planet in general. I don't think humankind's ready yet. I don't think we can get over our problems as just different nations. We can't get over that viewpoint. We think an invisible line in the sand divides who we are as people, where if we want this aspect of like a world flag being placed on these planets where every single country can go, explore and live there, we have to get to that mindset first. Because I think what we'll probably see next is we'll see space voyages happening with one manned person and then a bunch of robots, where they just start sending out multiple small little carrier things onto different planets and having them, scan data. Right now we're in a data collecting phase.
No, that is true. So if you send out probes, or that will help. So a good example is in Star Wars. For the Empire, they have these probe droids they send out through the galaxy looking for certain stuff. Why can't we do the exact same thing? So send out, let's call them probes to probe what is out there. And if there's something of interest, then you can try and send a human convoy or a human presence to that location if technology exists. But right now, currently, because things are so far and it takes so long to travel there, it makes sense sending a robotic artifact or probe there. Because even if it takes a few generations to get there, it will still get there, and the people controlling it from Earth, or even though it's a few generations later, will still get the information needed.
Would the influence of like cryonics or some type of other anti-aging device be able to help with more ideas or more aspects for pushing towards sending manned voyages farther distances? Like, I think a lot of the issue is now like up for how long is it? How long does it take for a person to get to Mars? It's like an extremely long amount of time, right?
So at the closest point, it is, I think, something like 8 months.
Okay, that's not that long. I thought it was like a couple of years or something like that. But if you're talking about going the distance to another planet, maybe even farther than that, let's say like I don't know why you'd go, but some people probably would enjoy this aspect of going to Pluto. I consider it a planet. I grew up knowing that. Nobody's going to change my mind in that. But if we talk about taking a voyage there, that's a long time, like a couple of years, right? Like with the technology we have now. So if we talk about the direction, do you think it would just be easier to find a way to maybe freeze a person's? I mean, our science and cell regeneration, our science and cell growth, and all these other aspects that happen to do with our, inside of our bodies is so advanced compared to where we're at with propulsion systems or types of things that we use for space travel, where I go, it's hard to not think that, like, I get it that it's like a rat race. You have the astronomers want to do this and the geologists want to do this. I get that. But I also think that it would be very, very beneficial if we could all find a way to, we're all pieces to the same puzzle. Like one area we can work on space travel, but also being able to work on being able to hibernate while you're in space to make sure that your body doesn't change. So you can take these long voyages instead of having to rely on maybe technology or resources we don't necessarily have yet.
That is very interesting. So the limit that we have with traveling is we have the light barriers, and nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. But the problem is we don't have the technology to travel almost at the speed of light or close to the speed of light. The only thing we have that travels at the speed of light is light itself and electromagnetic radiation. So Wi-Fi signals, Bluetooth signals, magnetic fields coming from electronics that travels at 90% the speed of light or at the speed of light. So, for example, the closest star to Earth is Alpha Centauri, 4.2 light years away. So, if you travel at a speed of light going to Alpha Centauri, it will take 4.2 years for us to get there. So, if we travel, say, example, 70% the speed of light, it's still going to be a few years till we get there. So, the idea is that will be cryogenics comes into play. If we have technology, we cryo freeze the person, and when they are close to their destination, they are unfrozen and woken up. So another theory is you can do is to have something like a generational ship. So you are on a ship, you have children. So when you pass away, your children will man the ship, and they will have children, and they will have children until one of the generations reach the destination you are set or determined to reach. Um, but yes, speaking about the ethics about what we have with our molecular and biology. So right now, in theory, if you think about it, we have the technology to clone a person. So we already cloned sheep, we have cloned cows. We know how to clone a human being, but the ethical question is, are we allowed to clone a human being? And the next question is, should we clone a human being?
Do you think that these ethical concerns are also something that might hinder the progress of maybe something that could be an advanced thing for a civilization to be able to experience? Like, I do worry about ethics, but I also think with every type of really strong ethical decision, maybe it's based on my own morals. There are some things where it's like, look, if somebody wants to be cloned, if somebody really wants that, I get the ethical concerns behind that. But if they're doing something in the name of like discovery when it comes to space travel or going off to Alpha Centauri, I mean, the idea that we're thinking of in this scientific way, the more realistic aspect is that if a person travels to that planet and decides that they're going to be the first one on that planet, they're more than likely going to waste that chunk of their life and not get it back, but they're going to have kids, which is going to be the era of a new generation that is born on a new planet. So you gotta have to put your selfishness aside and look at the grand aspect of the future of the human species.
So, yes, everything comes down to that question: is it ethically correct? You can philosophize about it and say, but yes, you can offer up your comforts to make sure your children will live on a different planet. And those are some interesting and serious discussions going to be pop up quite regularly now in the future, especially when you see NASA, Boeing, SpaceX aiming for Mars within the next 10 years. So the first colonizers or people setting foot on Mars won't be able to come back. So the question is, will you sacrifice yourself to go set up a new colony?
Well, I mean, we've known NASA to do risky missions before with a plan that they probably wouldn't be getting the people back. There's this like idea of like it's a one-way trip type scenario. Now, I think with the amount of scrutiny that media has on NASA or the amount of scrutiny that the public has just in the direction of these voyages in general, I think that might influence their decision on taking these types of trips. But I also think like you have to look at if the person is accepting the fact that they're going to go to this planet and probably never come back. I mean, if they're willing to still sign up then is it unethical? I mean, it seems ethical if you got their consent.
Yeah, I agree. If people consent to it and know what the dangers is and if they will be coming back or not or what their role is, then I think there's no problem with ethics.
Hmm. And when it comes to AI, though, cryonics, it really isn't something that people like. There are some people that entertain it, but there's some people that are like, our technology is not even close to there. And I know they're still trying to pull funding for it. But when it comes to AI, do you think that it would be easier to have these types of machines that could land on there and just get virtual reality really good to be able to explore through the eyes of those machines?
I think that would be much easier. But speaking about AI itself, another pro you could say about AI is if you think about work situations that is very dangerous. So, for example, working on oil rigs in the deep sea or working in mines. You can save human lives if you have AI doing all the work.
Yeah, that comes into ethics again, too. Same thing with ethics with cloning rights. You have ethics with robotic rights.
That comes in. So it is what is the ethics, and each country's ethics differs a little bit. So nowadays general consensus, but each country's ethics differs a bit as well. So that's going to be also something interesting to monitor for the future.
Well, if you think with that direction that we head in with AI being able to do maybe things based on depending what your ethics are in your country, would that be something that we just look at like how we do now with some religions? Like in some places, a different religion is a priority, and then in other places, it's not even close to a priority. So I go, would that be the same thing with the development of AI technology? I mean, if we're using it for space travel, I mean, if our ethics is we can use them to do whatever the hell we want, and then some other places like, well, we actually care about their feelings, that would just be mandated by country.
I think so. So I think each country will mandate what can be done and what can't be done about it. But I think organizations such as the United Nations will also have input to it, and NATO will also have input to it. For example, what can you do? For example, you can do something, you cannot do something. What applications can you do and what applications you cannot do?
Going back to the alien subject, because I know you're a you lecture physics as well too.
Mhm.
How much weight do you put in the multiverse theory?
So, for me personally, statistics show that the multiverse is possible. And I know it hasn't been proven yet, but yes, the math makes sense.
Okay, can you explain a little bit of the math to me? Because I'm very, very new to I didn't even know it existed until someone mentioned like there's scientists that study the multiverse. I'm like, hang on a second, you're telling me there's other realities of versions, maybe not necessarily like ourselves, but it that is commonly linked in with the idea of UFOs and stuff like that. Are we coming across anomalies from another universe or another dimension type thing, which to me is a little bit more plausible than just alien life reaching here. I don't know why, but I just think with the idea that we're now discovering that there's like not just dark matter, but there's white matter, like there's other things that we're now learning more and more about, where I just start wondering, I think there's a bunch of things that we're necessarily not picking up maybe from our consciousness aspect or just with our physical eyes, but you could probably see through a different type of lens.
So yes, so I'm not a particle physicist. So my information about this is very dangerous. You
Okay.
can call it that way. But where the multiverse comes in, if you start studying particles, so we know as we're sitting here as humans, and we have your computer in front of you. Your computer is probably on a desk, but that can be divided into molecules, and your molecules can be subdivided into smaller particles. And the bigger particles that we have are the electron, and then your nucleus of the atom that has your protons and neutrons. But your protons, neutrons, and electrons can be broken up into even smaller pieces, and that is called quarks. You get up quarks, down quarks, strange quarks, and charm quarks. Quarks can be split into even smaller subcategories. So that is where, for example, the Higgs boson particle comes in and a few others. And that is where string theory comes in. It's also not proven yet, but a lot of research has been done to string theory. Is those small elemental particles, can you break them down into even smaller particles? So the idea is that everything consists out of small strings, but you can think about it, for example, as the strings on a guitar, or if you play a piano, the strings of a piano. And if you play a certain note, that string will vibrate, and that vibration on that string will cause another string to vibrate. And that is called a harmonic. So the idea is that these different strings vibrates at certain frequencies, causing harmonics, and those harmonics are the small particles everything consists of. But something weird, and that's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that we have in quantum mechanics, is if you have a small particle, if you know where it is, you don't know what it is. But if you know what it is, then you don't know where it is. It's one of the weird things that came out of quantum mechanics. And one thing is that came out of that is the possibility of different dimensions or more dimensions. And that has led to the multiverse theories, saying that there could be more versions of you in different realities or different multiverses or different universes. And actually quite funny, a guy actually did a statistic saying that there is a small probability that you could be Batman in a different universe.
This sounds just like someone that went down the road of like quantum biology or quantum mechanics. And what happens with that, I feel like, is that you analyze something too much where you keep trying to pull back layers of an onion and eventually you hit the core, but you keep on going. And then it just seems like it gets into what I would call like whack science, but I don't really call it whack science. I think it's plausible. I just think that the general public isn't that far to get in there yet. And the information that we receive is very, very trickled down compared to the people that are involved in the fields of study that they're working in. I only bring up the idea of multiverses because there is a giant push out there. I think with any field of science, whether it's astronomy, biology, whatever you want to say, there is an idea of the origin of life. Where does the origin of life stem from? If we have maybe the perfect conditions that like Earth has to be able to grow this form of life that we are, where did we come from though? Did we come from some type of particles that trickled into the atmosphere, which where if we look at an exoplanet or one of these planets that are similar to conditions to Earth, would our genetic makeup affect that biosphere of that planet?
That's just, let me just search the name.
Did I say something that rings a
No,
bell?
no, no.
Okay.
So something. So what was the experiment's name?
I know these are really far out theories, but I'm hoping like they're like interesting to you because like I think about this stuff from the amount of people I talk to.
Oh, yes. So there's experiments. So let me just try to find the experiment's name if I search for it.
You gotta be careful when you type in experiments on the computer because you come across some stuff you're like, oh my God, we did that.
So what they tried to determine is if you go back to when Earth was formed, 4.5 billion years ago, what was the conditions on Earth like? So we know there were some primordial pools with uh, the building blocks of life in it. So you had a few elementary elements, such as methane. You had a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of nitrogen. So then they decided they're going to create a closed container, and they're going to add water and these elements. And they said, okay, the only thing they need from prehistoric times is heat. So they added a heat source and they left it for a couple of weeks. And when they monitor it, they saw that, oh, all of a sudden amino acids has formed. And amino acids are the building blocks of more complex molecules. Then it got scrutiny and said, but yes, why this changed your heat source? It's going to be heat source. Let's say it was lightning, for example. Then I said, okay, they gave the repeat experiment, changed the heat source for a light electric current. And again, they got the exact same result, and that formed amino acids. So it seemed like whatever caused these elements to form on Earth, or not form on Earth, rather to be formed while Earth was formed, was a key component of how life started on Earth.
That sounded so similar to the creation of penicillin. Like it by accident, you just left something in a jar and somehow it just created this type of bacteria or this type of thing that we now use as like an everyday science thing.
Yes, so that is one of the experiments that was done. And that brings us to the question. We are carbon based life. So we are consists out of carbon. All living stuff around us are formed out of carbon. But if you look at the periodic table, one element over is silicon and silicates. So who says somewhere in the universe the building blocks of life might be silicon? So that is completely answer. So right now we understand life as carbon-based, but who says it's not based on something else, for example, as silicon?
And we're back. Yeah, I don't remember what we were talking about, but I'm going to pick up on the concept of the origin of life. Uh, well, there's plausible theories out there, like we were mentioning a minute ago, about the fact that there is these conspiracy ideas that do come with aliens, and one of the conspiracies is that we did come from Mars. Now, is it a possibility? Maybe. I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff out there that I started learning about the Younger Dryas impact, where maybe the land that we know now wasn't the land that the dinosaurs grew up in. It was a completely different environment, but this one is suitable for us, which is why I brought up the concept of terraforming. I mean, there's a lot of things I feel like that are really, really, they seem very futuristic, but they're actually pretty simple in some aspects when it just comes to just adding something to a certain scenario or biosphere. We see this with animals. Talking to so many environmental science people and talking to evolutionary biologists, they talk about an adaptation that animals experience when their biome changes. Sometimes it can change a very small factor, and sometimes it can play a giant factor to where you have a whole different grouping of animals. You have a whole different scenario and a whole different landscape that didn't look the same before. And you can see this with the Sahara Desert. I mean, I just look at these concepts of things and I start wondering, what are we going to be able to do in the mindset of expanding out, research journey wise, whatever you want to say? Because the origin of life, or not even the origin, but the continuous factor of life, is it inevitable? Like, are we just going to constantly keep going and expanding, or is there going to be a stop to it? And I think also that fear that there might be some type of solar flare or some type of, like, you remember the Carrington event?
Oh, yes.
Something like that, that's, it might not affect us, but it might affect electronics. Society shuts down. And when society shuts down, it gets scary. And when it comes to fear, people don't really make rational decisions about things.
That is true. So when fear comes into play, people are not really rational. But one thing is the human species is a tough species and an adaptable species. So us as a species will continue evolving. For example, two of the best examples for recent human evolution is you'll see some people's teeth are the different. So have you ever wondered why people pull out a wisdom tooth?
I have
And
all four of mine came in.
oh, still have yours.
Well, I don't know if you noticed, but this just happened. I might be crazy, but in the past week, I had like my jaw was swollen, like huge. My jaw is bigger than it was last week. And that's because all four of my wisdom teeth up top finally have dropped down in instead of my bottom. And I noticed because if I go like that, I can hear my jaw click. And I'm like, I don't think that's good. I probably should go get that checked, but nah.
But that's one thing. So in the past, if we go back a couple of 100,000 years, the wisdom tooth was used to chew on plant materials. So, for example, same way as cows, they take a bite and people just chew and chew and chew and chew before they swallow. But now we are in such a place, we have refined foods, we have cutlery. So we don't need those teeth to cut down those plant material anymore. So now people are having problem with the wisdom tooth because in later generations, it seems like your jaw don't have place for those teeth anymore. And that is part of evolution. And another part is, let me just quickly search for it. No, the Afrikaans word for it.
Well, it's an adjustment in our diet. It's the same reason why some people of certain ethnicities have issues with vitamin D because they've been adjusted to a low amount of melanin in their skin.
So, for example, the same part as our digestive system and digestive tracts are also changing because we don't need to have the appropriate acids to digest certain stubborn plants and plant material that is a bit more difficult to digest because we now have a refined diet that we follow. So yes, human evolution is happening at a slow pace, but it's happening and that's going to continue happening into the future as well. It doesn't matter what life will bring to us or what will happen to Earth, human life and human beings will adapt and evolve.
Do you think that that brings in other fears when it comes to the aspect of what you mentioned earlier about Mars versus Earth? This whole aspect of like after generations upon generations that grow up on another planet, not only is your bone density going to change because of the gravity, but also what about your just bodily features in general? I mean, are you going to have bigger muscles? Are you going to have less muscle density?
That will have, say, for example, future generations. You have a child that is born on Mars. Mars has a lower gravitational field than Earth, so that means that child will have lower bone density and means also lower mass density. So when that child comes and visits Earth, that child is going to struggle for a while because that child won't be used to walking around in a stronger gravity field. So that means that child's bone density will be adapt to it and muscle density. But after a while, that child will adapt to it. So the bone density will become stronger and denser. That child will start to build the appropriate muscles and will adapt to live on Earth. But if that child goes back to Mars, then it will be a breeze because now you have a stronger or denser bone density, much better muscles. But after a while, that child will lose it again as they've spent more time on Mars again. So the human body is adaptable. So it can be good and it can be bad.
Well, imagine adapting to another planet to a point where you literally forget what your origin is, or your origin would change. I mean, you go to another planet like Mars. I mean, even pick a different planet, one that might not have as much light as this planet has. Well, eventually you just start maybe losing vision, you start losing hearing. Maybe it takes a long period of time for these adjustments to happen, but they eventually happen. Then you're not recognized as the same human species anymore. Now, I am taking a sci-fi route with it, mostly because there's a show called The Orville with Seth MacFarlane, where
Oh,
it's like a
yes, I love the
I
Orville.
know. The new season, the guy came in contact with like a fungus that was able to spray this chemical that they couldn't see, but it changed the guy's genetic makeup and made him a whole new species. And I go, I mean, after long periods of time, the people of Earth and the people of Mars, eventually the people of Mars are never going to be able to go visit the people of Earth because your genetic makeup doesn't line up with that planet anymore. It's the sense of making yourself too comfortable where it's like very comfortable to survive. For instance, me and you don't know the experience of building a house with our hands, being out in the freezing cold weather like my great grandparents or our great 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 grandparents that might have came over on a boat or something, because they had a whole different life. There wasn't an ease of access when it comes to food, when it comes to comfortability, when it comes to shelter. They had to build their own. Now we're in generations of kids where if the internet goes out, their whole day is ruined. And it's not necessarily saying that they're weak, but it's just saying the adaptable climate, the way that we use technology to make our lives easier. Eventually, if you talk about space exploration, I don't think you can permanently stay on another planet, even if you're born there. I think you have to experience every single aspect of it. I don't think you can be in space for super long either. I've heard the astronauts talk about pissing pieces of like, what is it? Pieces, it's peeing pieces of their yeah, some type of calcium from like their bones or something like that. So it's like, go ahead.
Yeah, so the astronauts actually losing bone density. They are losing calcium. So a good example of this was in 2019, the experiment NASA did with the twins, Scott and Mark Kelly, where I think it's Scott remained on Earth for a year, and Mark Kelly went up to the National Space Station for a year. Then, after a year, they actually tested to see how their DNA differs, and there were differences in their DNA. Now, I think the science behind it is called epigenetics, if I'm correct, where your environment influences your genetics. And yes, there were differences between the two.
Do you think that it's possible, and this is a very, very hypothetical scenario, and it might seem like a crazy question to ask, but do you think it's possible to master some type of telepathy if you were based on another planet?
I
Well,
don't think so.
the reason why I say that is if you mention string theory, the exact same thing you can link in with string theory is can be linked in with the same connection that every human experiences on this planet. To think that there isn't an invisible line or tethered cord that's connected to every single individual on this planet, maybe not so specific, but I also relate it to the twin connection. How two twins can kind of think and say, repeat each other's or say, like finish each other's sentences. I think it's the same thing where if you're thinking about me and I'm thinking about you, I could send a text to you and you're like, I was just thinking about you. That weird, what we call a coincidence, I think it's something that our we have as a species inside of us. That's something that maybe was stronger a couple generations back. But I think that that type of connection, that type of thing might be amplified in another condition or another scenario that might be a type of planetary causation.
That could be. So I haven't put much thought into that, but
Doesn't sound too
yes,
crazy though, does it?
no, it doesn't.
I had science to back it up. I was using a lot of
Ah,
I, if that becomes a thing or someone looks into that and discovers it, we get to name that. That's ours. We said it on a show.
oh, nice.
Okay. Just check. Um, and when it comes to what do you think or what would you want to happen in the next 5, 10 years? What do you think is like something that you can even take? Because I know a lot of your answers that you were giving do base in your field of work, but also they base in, I know there's a child aspect of you that really likes to talk about the sci-fi stuff of it too. What do you think? Do you think that we'll end up being able to maybe go 5 years from now, be able to pick resources off planets easier? Or do you think with just the expansion of like the past 10 years alone with exoplanets, the number has drastically increased? So I just wonder, are we going to be able to maybe in the next 5 years be able to start thinking about colonizing or be able to colonize on one of these exoplanets?
Yes, so what I want to see in the next 5 to 10 years, so for the hype, for example, for the space race in the 60s, 1969, when people watched the first steps of Neil Armstrong on the moon, and his popular words, this is a giant leap for mankind. As the same thing happening, for example, on Mars. So for first, get another person on the moon, get another person on Mars. And after 10 years, I would like to see more space exploration, more space colonization. And that brings me to a meme I saw a while back. It says, we are born just a bit too late to explore Earth, but a bit too early to explore the universe.
Yeah, we're in that weird like null phase where it's like we're not there yet, but we're also not at the start. So we kind of have like this middle ground that we're in stuck in.
And that is something I would like to see in the next 5 to 10 years, is just to have people on the moon again, to have the first person or people on Mars. And then from there, different colonization spread out to the asteroid belt, go to the moons of Jupiter, go to Europa, for example. That's also a place of interest. Go to Ganymede, go to Io, and start exploring the universe and start setting up more colonies. That is what I would like to see in the future.
Do you think that a cool direction or an interesting direction would be able to find a way to be able to grow another form of life on another planet? Necessarily, maybe not make it colonizing for us, but find a way to be able to include a lot of our resources, maybe on a place where there isn't so much damaging effects from our environment that we experience here.
That can also be an interesting topic to observe and to investigate. But yes, that could also be a possibility.
I had a not an astrobiologist, but an astroecologist that talked about what they use like easy plants to be able to grow on a planet that might not have the essential resources would be like cactuses and things that grow in really harsh conditions. And I just go, if you think about taking the same idea of space colonization or space civilization of building a habitat on another planet, just take it and make it smaller. And instead of having multiple people, make it like the Martian, where you have one person like Matt Damon who's monitoring all these plants that are growing on there.
Yes, that could be. An easy example is something like plankton in the sea. You would just need something like that to start the growth of something on a different planet.
How much weight do you put in nanotechnology being something that's going to be very, very useful in the aspect of
Oh,
space
yes,
exploration?
a lot of weight. So nanotechnology is actually being used right now as we speak. For example, the strength of materials. We use nanotechnology to construct different composites to have light and strong material that can be used in space travel, space exploration, and for protection of the astronauts.
Would that affect like different types of radiation as well too?
Yes, so we need to, for example, the best thing to shield yourself with radiation is gold. Gold will, so if you see some of the spacesuits has an inner lining of gold, that's why spacesuits are so expensive to block radiation. But if we can construct a composite material that's a lot more cheaper than gold that can provide the same level of protection, then that would be great.
Hmm. So like the five essential fields I've kind of noticed when it comes to this idea of like space travel is nanotechnology, regenerative medicine, which we touched on earlier, um, biotechnology. I think it's the same thing as regenerative medicine in some aspects, but also people classify it differently. Um, have you talked to any futurists before?
Not talked to myself, but I've looked at interviews and read a few of the interviews.
Okay. I've had a few on my show. I don't know if you've caught any of those episodes, but they're definitely interesting. It's where the questions I ask will be based upon a lot of what I learned from them. I think it's a good idea to think that far ahead about things. I just wonder if it's we're, our stomachs are kind of too small compared to what our eyes are seeing. Like we might just be biting off more than we can chew in some aspects. Cause I think a lot we do have to worry about the technology we have now, not what we can predict 5, 10 years from now.
Hmm. Now, I totally agree. And the future will definitely be an exciting place for all of us.
Yeah. Well, Heystek, I appreciate you giving me your time. It's been nice being able to chat with you again. Nice knowing you all these years as well,
Oh,
too.
for you too.
Yeah.
I'm
Is it?
always happy to be on your show.
Thanks, man. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
So, yes, you can find me on Facebook, just Heystek Grobler. So, Heystek, surname Grobler, Grobler, or Instagram at Heystek Grobler, or Twitter at Heystek Grobler.
I made sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blind.